Poland controls Western and Lviv, and then Hungary's taken this section of Ukraine. Why do some leaders still think that this is some kind of, one, realistic narrative, and two, what do they hope to get out of it?
European history is messy, and it's bloody, and it's terrible. The westernmost parts of Ukraine used to be populated with Polish people and people who spoke Hungarian.
How do you feel now that you've had a bit more time to digest what you saw on Thursday night with Biden and Trump?
Donald Trump is only interested in more wealth and power for himself. A lot of people in the United States, from rural areas or small towns, they hate big government. They don't care about Emerald City, Washington, D.C. They hate the bureaucracy. They hate the red tape. They hate the regulation. This dynamic has always been there. It's Thomas Jefferson versus Alexander Hamilton.
This is The Global Gambit.
Ukraine is omnipresent in the international sphere, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about it from the sort of outward looking in perspective. At the time of recording, Ukraine has just finalized its candidacy procession talks, or the initiation of its procession talks ascension talks, I should say, into the European Union. And there is continued talks about, obviously, the role of NATO with the recently new elected Secretary General, Mark Rutte, of the Netherlands. And also the EU is finalizing its leadership. Von der Leyen is likely to retain her position. But we've got a new, should we say, highest diplomat in the form of Estonia's leader. So some big moves, which could influence the situation for Ukraine in the short to medium, but potentially longer term as well. And to discuss that is, hopefully I can say, friend of the channel, Jake Bro. I don't think he needs too much of an introduction. Some of you, I'm bound to know who he is and come over from there. And if you're watching it, then welcome to the Global Gambit. Jake is a United States Air Force veteran and served as a nuclear and missile operations officer in the 13N. And he's now, I guess you could say, synonymous with anything to do with Ukraine and very optimistic and positive news delivery on the YouTube platform. And someone who's been kind enough to give me words of wisdom on this show as well. But Jake, it's lovely to have you. How is Vegas at the moment?
Thanks for having me back, Piotr. And we were just talking about it, but it's 110 degrees Fahrenheit, about 43 degrees Celsius here in Vegas. I signed up for this when I moved here, and for about 4 months out of the year, I just really can't go outside. But it's nice and cool in my home, and I'm happy to be able to speak with you in London.
Yes, it's London is, for my British viewers, as quintessentially overcast and grey for July. What else would we ask for? But Jake, I think the first thing really, you do your every day or multiple times a week sort of news summaries. And in the past, should we say, couple of weeks since the EU elections, what have you really noted the most from the sort of the diplomatic sphere? And then maybe we can come to some more specific details as we go into the conversation.
On the diplomatic front, a lot of posts have been changing. You mentioned we have a new NATO secretary, the outgoing prime minister of the Netherlands. The prime minister of Estonia also became, I think, the new foreign affairs executive for the EU. I'm not sure if I have that title right. I'm not European. So yeah, diplomatically, I think these are both tremendous assets to the European continent and NATO as a whole, because I don't think this hostility or this conflict or this adversarial nature with the Russians is going to change anytime soon. The Baltics and Poland are now discussing investing, 2.5 billion euros in defense lines. Maybe they should have started digging trenches 2 years ago, but better late than never. And Russia on Kremlin state TV every single day continues to indicate they're not going to stop these wars. They're going to keep going until they get back everything they think belongs to them. The old borders of the Russian Empire, the Tsars of 1917, they want it all. They're going back for it.
And I think one of the things that I noted quite interestingly is that visit by Viktor Orban to Kiev. I'm not entirely sure that it was widely anticipated. I read a couple of reactionary pieces, opinion pieces that were sort of like, oh, well, this is interesting because Hungary is obviously a country that likes to hedge, much like Serbia, I think we could say, a bit for different reasons. Have you been looking at that? And how do you feel about Viktor Orban as an individual in the situation?
Hungary was absolutely Putin's man on the inside. to have a member state of the EU and NATO basically working for you. That was Viktor Orban. But that was 2.5 years ago. For the minor players in this war, people like Lukashenko in Belarus, Orban in Hungary, collaborating, working with the Russians, this was supposed to be a smash and grab. This was supposed to be a 3-day special limited military operation. Belarus thought they would profit from Russia taking Kyiv, installing a pro-Russian government. And maybe Orban or Hungary thought they would get control of this majority-speaking Hungarian sliver of land inside Ukraine. Like, it's so stupid that Hungary is a landlocked country and they have such fierce nationalism of their glory days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Talking about, well, they speak Hungarian there, that therefore it should belong to us. We're not doing that. 1991 borders, those are the final borders. We're not going back to the age of empires. And I think this is actually a huge deal, Viktor Orban going to Ukraine, because we're 2.5 years into Putin's special limited military operation. And I think Orban is hedging his bets, thinking, well, Russia might collapse in the next year. Russia might lose. And then I've got egg on my face, being their cheerleader in effect for the last 2 years. So this was the least Orban could have done. It's a diplomatic visit. He showed up at the presidential house. He met with Zelensky on camera. It's a gesture. It's a goodwill gesture. I mean, Orban is not going to do anything to help Ukraine, but he is hedging his bets. He thinks that perhaps Russia might not come out on top on this conflict, and Hungary is going to have to remain inside NATO and inside the EU for the foreseeable future without any real help from Russia coming.
I think one of the things that I found quite amusing, I tweeted it, but there was an image of Zelensky and Orban standing together, and Zelensky looking, as he does, Orban when they were giving their public address, and sort of the caption that came to mind for me was, good of Putin to send his top ambassador to Ukraine, right? Because that's essentially in many ways what Orban has been in the European Union and NATO alliance. But just to drill down a little bit more on this, because for me, despite going there, and you could say good faith, ill faith, some faith, Ukraine was still on the receiving end of Orban saying that a large proportion of Western Ukraine is Hungarian, right? We've got this map from a few months ago with Medvedev standing in front of it, and this farcical idea that Ukraine is this rump state, Russia controls whatever areas it supposedly does, Poland controls Western and Lviv, and then Hungary's taken this section of Ukraine. Why do some leaders still think that this is some kind of, one, realistic narrative, and two, what do they hope to get out of it? What purpose do you think it serves?
Populists are also often nationalists. And to be a nationalist, you have to have callback to history and a period in the past that was great. And if we can only get back to that period in the past in which we were great, we can be great again today. There's numerous populists and authoritarians around the world echoing this message at the moment. And European history is messy, and it's bloody, and it's terrible. Yes, the westernmost parts of Ukraine used to be populated with Polish people and people who spoke Hungarian. But Joseph Stalin loved moving people around. So Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine were pushed out after World War II, forced to go west onto what traditionally was Polish territory. And the Poles were moved west, and they were relocated to what's now Western Poland, but used to be Eastern Germany. And this is what Stalin did to just make more room for the Russians. It's all about expanding the ethnic Russian base and the territory that their people, loyal to them, control. But we're not doing this. We're not winding back the clock. 1991 was the cutoff. That's when the Soviet Union ended. That's when everybody voted. Everyone's leader signed the pieces of paper. Those are the final borders. We're not going back. This is what the international rules-based order is based on. And leaders, democratic leaders around the world, have to speak up and tell people like Orban or Putin or whoever, the country you have is the country you have. Stop talking about the past.
To be devil's advocate, because I think it's important to, even if we don't agree with them, but we can't shy away from acknowledging the other rhetorics that we see online. But people will counteract your point with the argument that we're seeing populism rise. At the time of recording, France is in the midst of a very volatile snap election, the national rally of which Le Pen obviously has made quite a few statements of, should we say, sympathy, apologistic sympathy towards Putin. Is likely to win. Maybe not an outright majority, but a very strong majority. What do you say to those people who say, well, clearly there is a nationalistic, populistic front here that is more sympathetic, and maybe there is some truth to it, and that what Russia's doing is understandable?
For a lot of people, I think in Europe and even North America, that end up in these right-leaning parties, that their leaders are sympathetic or supportive of the Russian position and the Russian narrative. They might not personally believe that, but that's just, they're being a team player. They care more about other issues. The war between Russia and Ukraine might not be one of the top 5 issues for a voter for the National Front Party in France. Yes, that's maybe what Marine Le Pen, the leader of the party, believes and supports, but they care more about immigration or social issues or whatever. I'm not deeply interested in the domestic politics of France, but even as an outsider, I'm smart enough to know that there's a lot of people in Europe furious about the influx of refugees and immigrants from the last 10 to 15 years. People in Germany say this doesn't feel like Germany. People in France say this doesn't feel like France. Immigration, getting people to assimilate is difficult, and usually it takes generations. As Americans, we're a nation of immigrants, and anytime a new wave of immigrants showed up, whether it was the Poles, the Italians, the Irish, there was always this hostility towards them from the people who had been there longer, saying, well, we're real Americans, and these people getting off the boat, they're terrible people. They're impoverished, they're thieves, they're criminals. So what's happening now with the wave of immigration and refugees from places like Venezuela, it's the exact same thing. But the experience here in America is, give it a generation, their kids will go to American schools growing up with Americans, and within 20 or 30 years, they're American, indistinguishable culturally. And that's maybe something that Europe just doesn't have widespread experience with. As an outsider, that's just my assumption, my guess. I could be wrong. So these voters wanting these far-right national parties, I get it. When you see crime and it comes from a refugee or an immigrant, you want to attribute all refugees, all immigrants are criminals. That's not fair. That's not realistic. This is the debate happening between the multi-party system in France and elections in other EU countries as well. I don't have a solution here. I'm just stating the problem. The solution is something that collectively these people in these countries have to find a way to help them assimilate. And then once again, zoom out and think about the big picture. Immigration is good. These people work hard. They pay taxes. Because of declining birth rates, European countries desperately need immigration. Otherwise, they'll go the way of places like Japan, which doesn't really allow immigration at all.
Yeah, I mean, this is a part one of a part two we're having with you. And this is focusing on, as I say, more of the foreign policy, the outward, inward sort of perspective, right? But I know, I 100% agree. I find what is frustrating in geopolitics, done often deliberately, as we've touched upon in, I think, our previous sessions earlier in the year, is, people like to make things very binary, very black and white, and that's just not how it works. And immigration is inherently good, but it needs to be managed. And every country has a right to determine the style of migration. I think that's within reasonability. But I'm curious for your perspective a little bit more on an American looking at Europe. And we've just had these elections. I'm not going to ask you about the elections themselves because I appreciate you're not European. But what do you look at that from an American perspective, and the fact that we've got this continent which is sort of united about Ukraine, but also has these fragmentations? Does that concern you? Or you just think it's par of the course as is in the US situation, which we'll come to in a bit?
NATO, is it like 32 countries now or something?
Yep.
If one says we don't want to do anything, we don't want to help, hopefully the alliance is still strong enough where we can continue supporting Ukraine. The deal now with Viktor Orban in Hungary is no Hungarian funds or money, whatever, is going towards supporting Ukraine, because that's what Hungary wants, and that's the deal the EU or NATO has made with the country. But then you don't get a say. You don't get a vote on future matters because you got to carve out. Funds from your country are not going towards Ukraine. France is a big player. France is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, the G7. It'd be great. They do have military power and capability. But even if the far-right party gains control, a majority in their lower house, Macron is still president. We'll still have divided government for several years in France. And I actually think Macron, even if the party in parliament was hostile to him, he would double down on Ukraine. He would probably think Ukraine is a more important issue for the next election for him and maybe a different party to defeat the far right in France. So it could be an opportunity, but even if it's not, and France's contributions to the war effort are scaled back, there still should be excess capacity in other countries willing to continue the fight and support Ukraine.
Indeed. I think, as we've seen with Giorgia Meloni as well, someone who you might think to be quite populistic has been very steadfast. And I think Meloni's actually been one of the biggest vocal supporters of specific funding and humanitarian aid, right? At least in the EU area. I think the EU provides more humanitarian aid versus the US, which is more military. But
this is not something to count on, but often, what you say when you're campaigning to gain power is different than when you actually take power. Because when you take power, you're now responsible if things go wrong. I think the reason why Macron flipped over the last 6 months is Russia's expeditionary forces in Africa disrupting their neo-colonial empire. I'm not going to get into the politics if it's acceptable. I've watched a couple of videos explaining how France, through their currency, the central bank-controlled currency of West Africa,
CUF,
keeps the West Africans sort of indebted to them because they've pegged the currency at half the rate. I'm not going to get into the specifics. I'm not an expert on this. But once you take over and you're in power and you're now responsible for these economic assets to modern day France, well, are you really going to continue supporting the Russians when they're actively undermining your economic security and your economic future as a French person? So maybe, once again, they just need the intel briefs, or they need to be spun up, or this is always their plan to get people who sympathize with Russia to vote for them. But the second they have power, they know they're responsible for the future of their country. And then they take the exact same steps Macron take, because Macron has all the information and he is objectively doing what's best for the French people.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the last time we spoke, I hadn't really fixated on what this podcast was meant to be about, what the show was about. And I have, and it's sort of reimagining what the West's role is in this world, which is changing whether we like it or not. And the French-Russian dynamic and the Sahel is a good example of that. What you're thinking of is the CFA, or Central African franc, which is the currency of about six countries, and many see it as a sort of form of continuation of colonialism, or at least oppression, and France benefiting from that. So, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, I want to bring in the United States, obviously, a little bit here because, well, at the time of recording, we're just under a week from a certain presidential debate, which, I saw the thumbnail of your face and your reaction, which kind of summarizes how I felt as well. What is happening, Jake? Like, what should we do? Not just from an American perspective, but, NATO. I want to talk about a Trump scenario a little bit later, but, how do you feel now that you've had a bit more time to digest what you saw on Thursday night with Biden and Trump, and what it might mean for Ukraine?
Donald Trump is a fascist. Donald Trump is only interested in more wealth and power for himself. But there's a lot of people in the United States, a lot of factions that view him as an instrument. A lot of people in the United States, from rural areas or small towns, they hate big government. That's the way it's always been. 250 years, people in rural areas and small towns, they don't care about Emerald City, Washington, D.C. They hate the bureaucracy. They hate the red tape. They hate the regulation. This dynamic has always been there. It's Thomas Jefferson versus Alexander Hamilton, going back to day one of our nation. Alexander Hamilton wanted a strong federal government that did stuff for the people. And Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, and he didn't want the government to have any power or to do anything. And they're both right. You can make the argument for either one. Local representation, local governments is the most accountable and responsive. So local governments should be making more decisions. But at the same time, if you want your nation to prosper, we need federal programs. We need national standards for some basic things just to be competitive in the world. Competitive with Japan, competitive with Germany. To say to every local city council, you need to figure out this and do that, when we could just have a national system or a national standard. So I understand the argument for both, and Donald Trump is neither. Donald Trump is a fascist, and he's only in it for himself. This Supreme Court ruling this week terrifies me, that the President of the United States is above the law. The President of the United States is now a king. Another word for a king is a dictator. But as a former military officer, this is horrifying that the President of the United States is above the law. He can give any order he wants. And as long as he can make the argument, it's part of his official capacity as the president, then he's immune from any criminal prosecution. So there's really not more to say about that. But talking about Trump, the people who are voting for Trump and support Trump care about other issues. And Donald Trump talks about electrocution and sharks in his rally speeches. He doesn't give specifics. He doesn't talk about what he'll actually do. So this opens the window for people to interpret it. Trump is a Rorschach test. You can see whatever you want. If you think he will, seal up the border and deport 10 million people, okay, he can't. He physically can't. The scale of ripping 10 million people here illegally and deporting them wherever, it's a logistical nightmare. He didn't do it in his first 4 years. He's not going to do it in the next 4. But people believe it, and they're willing to support Trump on the belief, along with a whole host of other issues. People who support Russia also support Trump, hoping that he'll pull us out of NATO and cut off support for Ukraine.
Okay, so let's be more specific on policy for a second. NATO is the, shall we say, banner or the symbol of what we consider with Trump vis-a-vis Ukraine, right? What would Trump do? And there was an interesting piece in Politico, I'll mention it in the description, that came out at the time of recording like 24 hours ago, but it's talking about the plan for NATO is emerging. And from what we understand, they envisage a, quote, radical reorientation, which you could summarize essentially as Washington, as the US taking more of a backseat to Europe, and ultimately this cutting of a deal. I think, well, not that I certainly believe anything much Trump says, but this idea that there'll be a peace plan and established by the end of 24 when he was still president-elect is ridiculous. But he does believe he can reach some kind of peace agreement, right? And force the Ukrainians to capitulate in giving up the existing territory that Russia controls. What's your take on Donald Trump sort of trying to make NATO not leaving NATO, but severely gutting it or severely reducing funding to NATO? How do you feel about that? And what when let's say it would happen? Let's entertain that for a second. What do you think it would do?
If you're an isolationist, if you're an American isolationist, you're thinking to yourself, we're not going to have a war on the North American continent. The United States isn't going to be invaded by Mexico or Canada. So why are we so involved in European affairs? So it's not necessarily a bad thing if militarily Europe does more to protect Europe, because with the Mediterranean and the North African coast, the Middle East, Russia collapsing, Europe's security is going to be precarious for decades to come. It's not going to improve the security situation surrounding Europe. So if you just say, I'm an isolationist, I'm American, why do I care? Why is my tax money going towards this? It's a very simple, compelling argument, but the converse of that is the EU is the United States' largest trading partner. We have over 1 million American citizens living and working in the European Union and the UK. So yes, there's an obvious argument that Europe's interests are deeply tied to America's interests. There is no peace and prosperity here in the United States without peace and prosperity in Europe. So there's the two arguments. People are going to pick whatever one they want to believe. But yes, Europe has to do more, and Europe is doing more. And I think this is a good thing, either way.
No, I'm glad you do acknowledge the European inertia, shall we call it. I am very frustrated with certain countries that don't carry their weight, and not something that this is an endorsement of Trump world, but there is a point that if you are going to expect to have those security assurances, you step up in your own, what you can relative to your size of economy, population, and so on. Okay, let's reorientate to Biden. Growing calls, even the New York Times editorial board, so many, establishment, steadfast publications saying that Biden should step aside. How do you feel about that? And also, who do you envisage replacing him were he to step aside?
I am a Biden voter. Biden has my votes because I just want democracy in the United States to continue. If Trump is elected, we will not have free and fair elections in 2028. Trump will use the full force of the Justice Department, the United States military, the FBI to undermine and arrest his political opponents and to ensure that either he stays in office, Don Jr. becomes president, or whoever he selects becomes president. We are not going to have a free and fair election in 2028 if Donald Trump is in the White House. This will be the last one we ever have. And this is what they have in Russia. One-party rule. This is what they have in China. One-party rule. This is what they have in North Korea. One-party rule. And this is what a lot of MAGA people here in the United States openly say. We need to change the laws to ensure that Democrats can never win or have a majority in anything ever again. We need a permanent one-party rule here in the United States. The Republican primaries are the only choice you actually get. And then they win. And they'll always be in the majority. I would not like that because as an American, having only two options isn't great, but at least I get two options. And we can flip back and forth between two people we don't really like. So I do think Biden's a good person. The stuff that the Trump campaign says that, the Biden crime family and nonsensical stuff when Joe Biden's been in government for 54 years and he's the most squeaky clean person ever. Biden is a true believer in American democracy. He loves the lore and the history and the tradition, and he takes his oath of office and his commitment to the Constitution very seriously, unlike Donald Trump. So concerning Biden's age, yes, he's too old. 81 is ridiculous. To imagine that we're going to reelect Joe Biden, he turns 82 in November, and then Biden at 86 is still going to be giving like a State of the Union address in front of Congress, an 86-year-old man having to stand up there. And this is not a great look for the United States, but in many ways, this is symbolic of our economic struggle and our economic decline. I have my opinions on what's causing it. What's actually causing it is not part of the public debate at all. Nobody is talking about how we've restructured the tax code under the Reagan tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, and the Trump tax cuts. Money is being extracted from the middle class and the poor and given to the wealthy. This is just objective. When you actually look at the charts and the maps, this is what is destroying America. But neither party is going to talk about it because both parties have to court the millionaire vote. Bernie, the populist, he was close. Bernie had a winning message, but he did not get the nominee in 2016 or in 2020. And we got Biden, and it has to be Biden just to stop Trump. It's a coin toss at this point what'll happen in November.
But where does that leave us? What does that say about the state of the United States, but the broader West? That I think that was the most broad sentiment, which was that because of how badly Biden performed in the debate, it overlooked the fact that Trump was not Trump, right? And the copious amounts of lies that he filtered out. But the main takeaway being that everyone was like, this is absolutely, this is the best the United States of America has to offer at the moment. Where do we go from here? And how do we ensure that, Biden is is able to run, or there's someone who's able to take over. I don't know. Like, what does this mean? How do we ensure that this doesn't do permanent reputational risk to or reputational damage, to the United States, even if we get a non-Trump person in? It will undermine.
The United States has already ruined its international reputation. Even for people who support Ukraine and support democracy, I don't know anybody that's too enthusiastic about the United States and our modern history. The post-Cold War decisions that the United States has made, it's all been pretty nearsighted or just outright evil. I was 19 in March of 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq. George Bush and Dick Cheney are war criminals. They should be in prison right now. They lied about WMD. And it was a war of convenience. They thought going into Iraq would be easy. A special limited military operation. There's that famous clip of Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, saying, will this war take 3 days? Will it take 3 weeks? I doubt it'll take 3 months, or something ridiculous like that. And the United States stayed there for 15 years. And I do think big picture 2003 was a pivotal moment, because when the United States invaded Iraq in violation of the UN, and I want to make this point that China and Russia were not vetoing a Security Council resolution for the United States to invade Iraq. It was France. France was the one who was vetoing this resolution that George Bush wanted. But as soon as the United States said F you to the UN and went into Iraq, well, that kicked off a lot of things. Iran says we're next. We need to militarize. We need to get as much military capability as we can because the United States says we're next. North Korea was added to the axis of evil in George Bush's State of the Union address. So this was 2003, and by 2005, North Korea had a nuclear weapon because they thought they were next. Russia, Vladimir Putin, I do think in the early days, Putin flirted with the idea of Russia being a liberal democracy. He then saw what Bush did in Iraq and said, oh, no, I guess history hasn't changed. We're still talking about global power and, great nation, great man history. Where if you have the might, you can just do whatever you want.
Might is
and
right.
I think that set Putin and the Russians on a completely different path than they would have if the United States hadn't invaded Iraq. And what Putin is doing, I've made this argument, but Putin doesn't understand why the United States cares. If the United States didn't like the government of Mexico and wanted to invade Mexico, topple their government, and replace them with a pro-American government, Russia would be fine with it. Russia wouldn't say a damn thing because they expect the opposite in return. If Russia wants to invade their neighbor, topple the government, and replace them with a pro-Russian government, that's their right as a superpower, and the United States should stay out of it. China feels the same way. So the United States is guilty of a serious crime in their history, which has undermined our respect and our authority and our ability to talk about democracy and what's right and what's wrong in this world. So as an American, I want to state that fact. That's entirely our fault, and it's going to take a generation to make up for this, for what George Bush and the Republicans did.
I appreciate that, level of sort of introspection and humility, because I think a lot of people who watch the show will be like, oh, typical, like, out of touch, hypocritical, la-di-da. And I think that's very good of you to do that. I guess the last quick question I have for you really is, what would you suggest if you had, not pretending that you have all the answers, of course, but what would you try to prescribe for anyone who watches and has any?
Ukraine has to win. Ukraine has to win. Give Ukraine everything they need, every tool, every weapon, every capability, remove all restrictions. Russia has to be defeated. Otherwise, China is going to make their move. Iran's going to make their move. These wars will never end if Russia is allowed to succeed. The world is too dangerous if Ukraine doesn't win this war.
And I'm into that. But Jake, thank you. It's been very good to speak to you for this part one. More of the foreign policy, but we'll be coming to the military analysis, which I know you're even better placed than I think you're, great positioning on this already. So everyone, if you enjoyed this, then be sure to give it a thumbs up and check out the next one, which will be somewhere on your screen now. But thanks, everyone. Wish you peace of mind. Take care.